people that have been subjected to narcissistic abuse tend to have a greater chance of experiencing future narcissistic abuse for a lot of different reasons that we'll talk about. But that's super important, right? We can get free and heal all we want, but if we just get sucked right back into a cycle with a different person, relationship, workplace environment, then the abuse just continues to happen. And it's a much harder life to live trying to constantly heal from that abuse to only re-encounter it. So we want to be free from it once and for all. Before we can even talk healing steps, there's a question that has to be asked. And a lot of times people aren't super excited about this question, but it is a really important one. And that is the narcissist still in your life? A lot of people try to have some level of interaction or relationship with the person that is narcissistic or has narcissistic traits, because it can be a family member, it can be a partner, maybe it's a workplace environment situation and you can't leave your job. So there's like some level of interaction that has to happen. But unless you are proficient in the steps that we're about to discuss, like unless you are pro status in the things we're going to talk about, then it's really likely that you're going to continue to be used or fed off of like a parasite, right? Like a host, or abused. So for the sake of this discussion, we are going to assume that the narcissist has been removed from your life. If not, if you still have to have interaction with that narcissist, or you haven't gotten to a place yet where you're ready to go no contact or apply what's called the gray rock method, that's an entirely separate conversation, maybe a different session. But for this session, we're going to assume that the narc has been removed from your life and that you are largely, if not completely, no contact. Okay. So I'm going to go through, I think I have 6 or 7 steps here that I walk people through when I help them heal from narc abuse. That doesn't necessarily have to go in this order, but this is kind of the way I see it unfold. And this is how to cleanse yourself, right, from that parasite, to really heal thoroughly all the way from the abuse, from the damage that's been caused. And then once we get to those steps, we'll talk about like how not to be a host in the future, because they piggyback off of each other, obviously, right? All right, so step 1 is very basic, but people all too often try to skip it, and that is establish safety. You have to. Narcissists or very toxic or abusive people that have narcissistic traits demolish and destroy our safety on every single level, right? Mentally, emotionally, physically, financially, socially, sexually, spiritually. Like it can destroy you on every level. It doesn't have to be on every level, but there's often, every level gets touched in some way. So our safety, internal and external, gets compromised. So a lot of people end up going into sort of like a hermit season. They tend to isolate in the very beginning because relationships or even the world at large can feel really, really dangerous. And that's okay, right? When I work with people coming from narcissistic abuse, that is the need to hermit and sort of isolate is coming from a different place than if somebody's like in a depressive state and they're like retreating from the world. Safety is absolutely paramount. And if relationships trigger you, people trigger you, the outside world in general is triggering you, we need to reduce the level of triggers happening, and we have to get some safety going in order to heal, right? It's kind of like you can't heal from the trauma of going through a house fire if you're still in the house that's on fire, right? You have to get removed from the situation on all levels. Now, this can range on a spectrum all the way from something like an actual safe house and big time interventions, which does happen. Many people end up having to flee or go into hiding from narcissists because they don't typically let you leave them, right? They can't handle that level of rejection and they feel that they might own you in some way. So we do see people have to flee these relationships, and that can be really confusing if there was no overt physical abuse, but it is way more common than we realize. So it can range from something like that to simply having to Establish how to carve out like a nest within your home is the term that I use for it. Creating a really, really safe place that allows your nervous system to regulate, allows you to feel completely at ease, where you can let down any walls, unmask yourself, because that's really vital to the healing process, right? And that can also include carving out time. If you live a really busy life and you can't not go to work and go to the grocery store and take care of your kids, then we might carve out time to establish feelings of safety. But safety is huge. You cannot, you know, if you're in a dangerous situation, you can't address healing from the wounds if you're still in danger. So safety comes first. And that looks different for everybody and is a step-by-step process. We want to just make sure we check all the boxes: mental, emotional, physical, that kind of thing. Obviously, things like financial or social might take time. Narcissists have a way of destroying our social and financial lives. So it's not like we can snap our fingers and fix that, but taking stock of where we are and having a plan is a step toward safety, okay? So we're going to get safe, number one. Number two, we're actually going to assess our wounds. So just kind of like in a war situation, there's active war where people are surviving and trying to get through it. And then once they do, you take stock, you take inventory, you assess the damage and what has happened. Being a victim of narcissistic abuse can very much feel like you live in a hurricane. There's often a ton of chaos and drama, and things are very stressful for a long time, and you could be in that state for a prolonged period of time. And so when you finally get out, it can feel like you've been spit out of a hurricane, and we can be really dazed and confused. That's why we get to safety first. But then we need to assess. We need to actually take a minute to look at the damage that has been done. This is another step that people want to skip a lot because they either don't want to look at the wound, or they don't even acknowledge that that wound is there because it's not something they can physically see. So when we're assessing our wounds, there's three things we're going to look at, because there's three main things that narcissistic abuse does to us, three main ways that it wounds us. The first is it destroys our confidence, which, if you remember from my teaching on confidence, that is self-trust, right? This is largely due to gaslighting. So people's self-confidence, their ability to trust themselves, trust their emotions, their perspective, their reality, is often completely tarnished, right? This can lead to things like really, really low self-worth, low self-esteem. This can make you susceptible to future abuse and can lend itself toward depressive states or self-harm or substance use. So we want to be aware and take stock of the damage done to our confidence, right? Not just how well we like ourselves, but really a strong emphasis on that trust. How well do you trust yourself? And that can be in several areas, right? Trust yourself to make decisions, trust yourself in a relationship, trust yourself to read a room, right? So we're going to look at that. The second thing that narcissistic abuse, the second wound narcissistic abuse often causes is PTSD. This is something that is not talked about enough because we still have a stigma toward the concept of post-traumatic stress disorder, reserving it for extreme circumstances like natural catastrophes or maybe physical abuse, which still gets a lot of focus when it comes to PTSD. But I work almost exclusively with people recovering from narcissistic abuse, and almost to a person, they have PTSD, right? They have post-trauma symptoms that are severe enough that it constitutes it to be a disorder. And that's because surviving narcissistic abuse can feel like surviving a war. And we've discussed this in previous sessions before, but psychological and emotional abuse and neglect can not only pack a greater punch than physical assault, it does lead to more severe symptoms of PTSD and longer lasting PTSD because we don't acknowledge it. We don't recognize it. It's not an actual black eye, right? So getting assessed for that, which you can do with the help of a professional. There's assessments you can take online. There's books and resources, right? But do not disqualify yourself from having at least post-trauma symptoms all the way up to something like PTSD simply because you think it wasn't severe enough. Minimization of what we've been through is one of the symptoms of something we see with PTSD. So we need to look at it. We need to assess for it. We need to see where we're at on that scale, because it's going to explain a lot about why we're feeling the way we're feeling, why we think the way we think, our functioning, and it's going to give us a roadmap on how to heal, right? With that, we tend to also see very high cycles of anxiety and depression, which is something common within PTSD itself. But this specific cycle gets misdiagnosed a lot. A lot of people think they just have anxiety or just have depression, or maybe have both, but don't understand that the cycle that they're going through is actually indicative of what has happened to their nervous system from being with a narcissist. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So knowing that narcissistic abuse often leads to something like PTSD is something you need to assess for and have an honest conversation with yourself about. And then the third way in which narcissists really wound us is in the practical ways in which they destroy our lives. I kind of already mentioned this, but because they struggle to take accountability, self-reflect, and don't see anything wrong with what they've done, they can oftentimes not be very good with their money. And if you think of that concept of a parasite onto a host, we do see narcissistic people actually gravitate toward intelligent, educated, successful, stable people because there's much more they can pull from there. So a lot of people experience financial distress or even bankruptcy. Narcissists tend to want to isolate you from support that may point out what they're doing. So a lot of relationships get destroyed. Our careers can get destroyed because we tend to have to sacrifice a lot. So we want to take inventory of where the damage has happened practically. And this helps to connect the dots, because a lot of people having their self-confidence, their self-trust destroyed, blame themselves. So this first step not only helps you assess all your wounds, it helps you to start breaking free from that instilled mindset that a narcissist gives you, where you can start being able to say something like, my finances got destroyed not because I'm irresponsible, but because this abuse took place, which is healing in and of itself, right? So this step 2 is an assessment of all of those wounds, where we're taking inventory of where we are in all categories of life: mentally, emotionally, physically, financially, socially, sexually, in our careers, whatever it may be, right? Now, this is when most people recognize that they need help and support in some way, right? So this can range from seeking professional help to having 1 or 2 safe people in your life that can hold space for you while you walk through this process. So that's a really honest conversation we need to have with ourselves. I tend to encourage professional help with this because the psychological damage from narcissistic abuse can be so confounding and confusing. It can be really hard to see the forest through the trees. So we need somebody, objective third party, who can really help us point out where those wounds are that we might have missed. But this is also something that you can do on your own. It just might look different. With that comes step 3. And whether you do this with a professional or on your own, step 3 is one of the most important steps. And that is the notion that knowledge is power. People who get trapped in cycles of narcissistic abuse don't understand narcissistic behavior. They mislabel it or misidentify it, or they project their own motives. Well, he didn't mean it. He wouldn't act that way, right? I don't think that's what they were doing. And so they get duped over and over again. Narcissists seek out specific kinds of people, right? And so one of the things that we're going to do, and this helps in that second step of how not to incur future narcissistic abuse, is we're going to learn. We are going to equip ourselves with so much knowledge, because that gives us power. So there's lots of different ways you can do this. There's obviously books out there. There's a lot of stuff on social media. There's even things like I had a client who used Pinterest because there was just very simple quotes that were like bite-sized chunks for them to digest. And obviously there's the use of professionals, but we need to learn the language. We need to learn the terms. We need to understand what was happening. And this is really healing, because one of the things that happens with narcissistic abuse is we do a lot of victim blaming. We blame ourselves. We think it's our fault because we've been told that. We've been conditioned to think that. And when you start learning terms, when you start learning that all narcissists act this way, when you see that there are millions of other people who have experienced this type of abuse, it helps you start to separate what you went through and that victim blaming you have. You learn that it wasn't you and you aren't crazy. There are names for what you went through and experienced, and you're not alone, right? So knowledge is very, very important. One of my favorite things that I see in with my clients is when people have that aha moment of realizing there's a word, there's a term for what they went through, because then it allows our brain to begin to process it, right? Remember our sessions on cognitive integration. That is vital. And narc abuse can be like that hurricane, right? There's what's called the narc fog, where we live in this sort of dazed, confused state. Nothing quite makes sense. They're super nice and charming one day, and then they do something that is passive aggressive and damaging in another, and you try to bring it up, and then they victimize themselves to that, and you just find yourself all twisted up. And so when we learn the language of what exactly it is they're doing, it helps us to be able to begin to process the trauma that we went through, because now we have a name for it, right? And that lends itself to step 4. So step 3 is we're going to equip ourselves with knowledge. Step 4 is kind of what I call like the demolition stage, or if we're looking at this like parasite analogy, this is like the cleanse part. We're going to begin tearing down the world that they constructed within us. Narcissists tend to gaslight in ways that really can equate to something like brainwashing. It's why we see narcissism within cults or cult leaders, because there is this strong emphasis on sort of conditioning people to see the world their way. It's how they create flying monkeys, right? So once we've assessed our wounds, and once we've got an idea of where the damage has been done, and we've learned the language of what that damage is and what it means, we have to deconstruct it. So if you've ever been somebody who's done deconstruction work, maybe coming out of religion or certain ideology or politics, you understand that like there is a demo phase where you have to tear down before you can rebuild. It's very much the same with narcissistic abuse. So we are going to focus specifically on the beliefs and the perspectives and the attitudes towards ourselves and others that have been birthed from the abuse. If you're someone who has experienced narcissistic abuse later in life, so not somebody who maybe had a narcissistic parent, but maybe you had a partner later in life, there often feels like there's this line in the sand where you can be like, where did I go? I remember I used to be somebody who was like confident or outspoken or, had sass to her. Like, where did that person go? And that is a really prime example of sort of what can happen to us being in a relationship where there's narcissistic abuse and they reprogram us. People often come out of narcissistic abuse a shell of a human being. And I quite literally mean that. Their sense of self has been destroyed. If you guys remember, I did that like 5-part series on sense of self as we talked about stages of development, and we looked at those 6 factors. Narcissistic abuse systematically destroys those. So that is who we are, right? And when that's been destroyed, we feel like a shell of a person. We've lived in survival mode, just reacting to this person, living our life for them, trying to keep them calm or stable or trying to keep them happy, which is how they want it, right? Think of that parasite example, right? If you have a parasite and they're taking all of your nutrients, they're taking, everything from you, your life becomes about trying to keep that parasite fed so it takes less from you and just trying to cope with how sick you feel. So we often feel very mentally or emotionally sick, and we need to assess for that. This is also a really vital step because part of the gaslighting has you believing that these are your beliefs, these are your thoughts, these are your perspectives. This is why having help or support, whether it's a safe person that can hold you accountable and be honest and reflect back to you, or a professional, we have to get ourselves to a place where once we take inventory of our thoughts and perspectives and beliefs, we begin separating ourselves from them and challenging them. We have to reprogram, right? And in that reprogramming, first comes that demo phase, comes that recognizing that you might think that you are worth nothing, but that belief was birthed from narcissistic abuse. And you come to that conclusion by challenging it and going, did I always feel that way? Now, if you're somebody who had a parent that was narcissistic, this can be more challenging because out the gate, right, your sense of self and identity was being conditioned by them. This is where reparenting comes in. You have to birth and parent and raise within you a whole new person. But you cannot get the healing that you need and deserve if you continue to hold inside of you the thoughts and beliefs and perspectives that the narcissist trained you to have, because that will not only set you up for future abuse from somebody else, because they're going to spot that, but it's going to keep you depressed, keep you anxious, keep you scared, keep you with low self-confidence, or low self-worth. And we have to break free from that. Once we've identified those beliefs, and that can take some time, we begin the reprogramming process. Now, that is a whole separate session in and of itself. This is where we see a lot of cognitive behavioral therapy come in. You guys know I've done tons of sessions on reprogramming and thought processes and how that works, CBT in and of itself. But that work is vital, right? Because so much of narcissistic abuse is psychological. We have to win that battle in our minds first, right? So like I said, some of these steps happen kind of all together or at once. It's not like it's super linear. And some of these obviously take time and will be shorter or faster than others. But I've laid it out like this just to help you guys kind of see overall what it looks like. So that is step 4. That's the demo phase of deconstructing the programming that that narcissistic person has given you. Step 5 is where we focus on healing, but particularly the trauma responses. You guys know I've talked a lot about this too, right? Narc abuse has absolutely devastating effects on our nervous system because we're consistently in the vicinity of a threat, right? And our nervous system knows it, but we often don't. We hear the term like wolf in sheep's clothing used to describe narcissists a lot. And so one of the things that's really challenging is that when we get around somebody that has ill motive, intent to harm, is deceptive or manipulative, our nervous system will often pick up on that. And so we will have an activated nervous system because it senses a threat. It senses a wolf among the sheep. But if it's your super nice, charming boss, or that really, really charming, amazing guy that you've been on a couple dates with, or your favorite uncle or aunt or whatever, right? We will convince ourselves to ignore that alarm going off inside of us, which breaks self-confidence and contributes to the gaslighting. But then our nervous system cannot heal in any way, right? So one of the most vital aspects of healing from narcissistic abuse is the retraining and regulation of your nervous system. This sometimes requires learning about it. We have to learn about our nervous system and how it works and the impact that being around a narcissist can have on our system. And who that person is and the length of time they're in your life and the proximity to you is important. There's a very big difference between a narcissistic boss that you were around for a year that you sometimes saw, but worked in different offices, and a partner of 10 years or a parent that raised you. Right? So we want to learn about the nervous system, how it impacts, how narcissistic abuse impacts that, and take into account those factors so that we can begin to heal it. It's really likely that if you have been a victim of narcissistic abuse, you lived in a sympathetic state in your nervous system, that arousal state where the trauma responses exist, right? Lots of anxiety, lots of cortisol. That's where that fight or flight, or most often with narcissistic abuse, fawn, that people pleasing, walk on eggshells trauma response exists. And depending on who this person was in your life, you might have lived there daily. You might have just always been there. You might have lived there for so long that it felt normal to you. And this is so important to understand if you want to not be a host in the future. Because if what parental love or romantic love was for you was a people-pleasing, fawning, trauma response activated nervous system, your brain will consider that familiar. So the next time a wolf comes among the sheep, you will spot them and you will go toward them because that seems familiar to you. It might even feel like that's what love is based off of how you were conditioned. And our nervous system is powerful like that. That programming of our brain is powerful like that. It's how most people get into repeated cycles of narcissistic abuse. That familiarity draws them to them, right? So we sometimes aren't even the ones who are spotted and sought after by the narc. We can tend to gravitate toward them. So understanding our nervous system and the programming it has, and then working to heal it is important. Now, something I'll say on this is that it is very common when people get out of a narcissistic relationship or get free from that narc abuse and establish some safety, that they experience like what I call a nervous system crash, right? If you've been in a activated arousal state for so long or cycled through these trauma responses for so long, your system is exhausted, right? Your body is exhausted. So many people experience this crash where they have extreme exhaustion. They're super lethargic. They maybe want to sleep all the time, or even if they don't want to sleep, they just want to do absolutely nothing. They just want to lay on the couch and stare at TV. We often start to judge ourselves and get really critical of ourselves in this stage. And it's really important to understand that this is your system trying to heal and reboot itself. So we often have to learn how to work with our nervous system and lean into those ebbs and flows, because to try to just white knuckle it and force yourself to continue to push past while it needs to heal is kind of like trying to walk on a broken leg. You're not going to get very far, right? So with that, right, we do the work of reprogramming and regulating our nervous system. This involves things like letting your nervous system heal, identifying what triggers you, and that's a whole separate session in and of itself, and learning what dysregulated versus regulated feels like. If you are a child of narcissistic abuse and your entire childhood was you being programmed for dysregulated, you might not know what regulated even feels like. And a lot of people can have fear toward that because regulated is our rest and digest state. It's calm, it's peaceful. And if that's not normal for us, our brain doesn't like normal and is like, what is this? Right? It's like going to a new place and being like, wait a minute, I think I'm lost. I don't recognize this place. And that can come with a lot of fear. And we have to work through that fear and become accustomed to a regulated state if we're going to break the cycle of seeking out dysregulated environments. There's a lot of victim blaming that happens where people say things like they're addicted to drama, and they'll like call people drama queens or say like, you're just obsessed with the drama, not recognizing that they just don't feel comfortable in a regulated state. So they subconsciously seek an environment that's going to dysregulate them because that feels familiar. And yes, chaotic, dramatic situations will dysregulate you. But we can't change what we judge, right? So if we're doing that and we're just judging it, we're going to stay stuck. So we need to recognize what's going on there, right? With that comes like the toolbox building kits, right? I've done lots of sessions on regulation techniques and coping skills and stuff. That's where this step really starts to come in, of like learning how to take your power back, learning how to take control back over your mind and your body and your system, and regulating yourself and then conditioning yourself to have that be the new norm, right? So a lot of times you see, like in the establishing of safety, that step one, this step is sort of in there because part of the establishing of safety is getting regulated. So you can see how they can sort of mix together or be happening simultaneously, right? All right, so then in the last two steps that we have here is, it sounds really simple. I've really simplified this down so that we can discuss it, but it's kind of laughable to even say it this simply, but you guys will know what I mean. So step 6 is heal from the trauma. And most people are like, well, yeah, of course, right? It's not something we do on a Monday, right? This is a big, big portion of it, but we're still going to talk about it so that we can look at what needs to happen here, right? So the reason I made it its own separate step and I put it after step 5, after the regulation, is that if we don't get control of our nervous system, if we don't practice taking the power back and building the skills to be able to regulate ourselves, and then we dive into trying to heal from the trauma from narcissistic abuse, we are far more likely to either re-traumatize ourselves or completely overwhelm ourselves. This is where I see a lot of people shy away from therapy because they think that that means stepping into therapy and just rehashing everything they went through while in this sort of trauma mode, right? And sometimes that does happen and people get hurt. Or even just in healing from narcissistic abuse, people think, oh, I've got to dive right into thinking about all that happened to me. We want to separate the two because we don't want any further harm coming to us. You guys know I say it all the time, don't let the trauma win, right? Don't let that narcissist win. One of the things that they would be more than happy to hear about is that you're continuing to suffer from what they did to you previously. And one of the ways that you can stop that and break that cycle is to get that regulation under control first, and then intentionally step into step 6 of healing from the trauma from either a regulated state or from a place of knowing if I do get overwhelmed or I do get triggered, I know how to bring myself back, right? I know how to recenter myself. So again, this is something that is done with stable people or with professional help. Sometimes we need time here. We need some time to pass, or maybe we need some distance, or we need a certain level of safety or stability to be able to revisit or walk through the trauma we've went through. The goal here is not just to talk about what you went through. The goal is to, from a stable place, cognitively and somatically integrate what you went through, the trauma from the abuse. And you alone get to decide what you're ready for. There are many people that are like, I can't talk about anything yet until I have a little bit more stability in my life. Like I have to, when taking account that inventory of wounds, maybe you have to focus on stabilizing your finances and your social life first so that you can then step into the past and work through those wounds. Or maybe you're ready to talk about a bunch of different stuff that happened, but it might be a couple years till you talk about those things, right? The ones that you're not ready for yet. You get to decide what that looks like, and there is no time frame or time limit on this, right? It can also be sort of a 5 steps forward, 2 steps back process, because we get to this place where maybe we've got some safety, some stability, we're regulating ourselves and our nervous system is healing, we're feeling great, and we're like, I really don't want to dive back into that stuff. It is vital, it is important, especially for future self-protection. But sometimes, we then dive back into and bring that stuff up, and it feels like we've had a setback because we get triggered or we have a trauma response or we get dysregulated. Maybe some nightmares or dreams come back for a bit. That isn't going backwards. You're not losing ground. It's sort of like lancing a wound that you let scab over to clean it out. Even though you couldn't feel anything with that scab, there was still an infection beneath. So we have to sort of re-injure ourselves intentionally in a safe way to clean and heal that. And it can feel a little bit worse in the moment, but it is pain that has a purpose because ultimately you're cleansing yourself of that narcissistic infection, right? So that it leads to greater healing in the future. So This is where I strongly encourage people to prioritize self-love and authenticity and self-advocacy in determining what you are ready for and what you are not, and not putting any pressure on yourself to deal with something you're not ready for. This is particularly true if you are a child of narcissistic abuse. There can be stuff that takes years to get to, and often there is stuff that we're not even aware of, where we get 10 onion layers deep and have a moment of recognizing that this whole couple years of your life, this whole stage of your life was riddled with abuse that you didn't even recognize because this type of abuse was worse. And that can sometimes catch people off guard. It can feel overwhelming, like, especially because narcissistic abuse can be so covert. We often don't just heal from the abuse we went through. We often learn about the abuse we went through that we didn't even recognize was happening. And that can be a little bit jarring or sometimes shocking, which is why we take it slow, right? So step 6 is a big step. It's the bulk of it, but this is where you're going to see so much healing happening. And then step 7 is sort of the wrap it up step. We've done the demo, we've gutted it, we've done the deep work. This is the build yourself back up step. Now, this is the one that everybody tries to jump right to. Most people come out of narcissistic abuse and would like to get some safety under their belt and then jump to step 7. But it's sort of like trying to build a house on a faulty foundation that has been set on sand. You will inevitably end up having to tear it all down and start all over anyway, because we have to heal from like the bottom up, right? We've got to heal from those basic areas first and work our way up. Once we've done that, and a lot of what happens in step 7 kind of can happen simultaneously as we work through the other steps. So it's not like you're waiting years or something to get to step 7, but I'm separating it out so that you can see that it's something we intentionally want to work on. So this is the step where we rebuild trust with ourselves. So we build our confidence. We develop emotional intelligence and maturity and emotional safety, so that we aren't a victim to anything in the past. Nothing has power over us. And we are protecting ourselves from people being able to manipulate us in the future, right? We build up and recondition ourselves to live a mainly regulated state in mind, in body, in nervous system, in emotions as our new norm. So this is where we see a lot of culture shock. If somebody picked you up and dropped you in a country you've never been to before, where you don't know the language, you don't know the culture, you don't know the customs, you don't know the norms, you don't know your way around, it's very, very overwhelming. But if you stay there long enough, you will pick it up. It will become familiar. It will become a new home for you. Transplanting ourselves out of the world of narcissistic abuse into a world of normal can be like culture shock. But this is something we're going to intentionally do. We are going to break free of any residual trauma responses that we have. You guys know I've done my teachings on trauma responses and how we can have them for so long they feel like our personality. We're going to heal enough from them that we separate ourselves and recognize, oh, I'm not a people pleaser. I just lived in a fawning trauma response for 35 years. So who am I? And we start to focus on the who am I then. We build up that person free from the trauma responses. In step 7, probably one of the most important things you'll do that is going to be a protective factor for you in the future is boundary work, right? Boundaries are vital. First of all, they're vital to any healthy relationship. All healthy relationships have boundaries. Because narcissists do not have healthy relationships, they don't allow for boundaries. So boundaries becomes your best friend in protecting yourself from narcissistic abuse. But that work also takes time because it requires self-awareness, self-love, self-advocacy, and to work through things like fear of confrontation or being conflict resistant. That's part of step 7 as well. If you have found yourself to be very conflict resistant or afraid of confrontation because narcissistic abuse will train you not to upset that person, they will make your life a living hell when you do. We tend to think that's what conflict and confrontation is, but it's not. And so we have to make peace with those concepts. We have to learn how to engage with them in a safe way, and then what that looks like in regular relationships, in normal, healthy relationships. And, in this, we just build up our toolbox, getting things like clarity on who you are, what life was like, the life you want now, um, increased self-awareness, which is probably one of the most important things that we can all have just in the healing journey in general, but specifically to protect ourselves from narcissistic abuse, and understanding, right? Understanding as to what happened, how you got to where you are, and how you're going to get to where you want to go. So this is a really strong build up phase where you're putting back the pieces, you're putting the pieces back together, and rebuilding who you are after the damage has been done. Everyone wants to jump to that stage because that's sort of the fun stage, right? But like I said, if you haven't worked through the trauma of those explosive, abusive ruptures, if you've got somebody saying, hey, you got to learn how to make peace with conflict, you're going to be so resistant, you're likely to just not. And then you're going to judge yourself and think that it's you and that you just don't want to, or maybe judge conflict and say, well, I just don't like it, not recognizing that your past still has a hold over you. That's why we heal that first, right? Okay, so those are sort of the 7 steps that I've laid out in how to heal from narcissistic abuse, how to cleanse yourself of that parasite and no longer be a host. But of course, the big question is, how do I make sure I'm not a host in the future? Right? How do I protect myself from ever becoming a host again, ever becoming a victim of narcissistic abuse again? So the question is sort of answered within what we just discussed, right? All of those steps, that healing journey, which can take time, right? I have many clients who are many years into it. I some people have said things like, I've just been single for so long, I'm not ready for a relationship, or I can't seem to go back to my hometown and I feel so bad. I am judging myself. It's been 5 years. If you have survived narcissistic abuse and you're on the healing journey, you've already won. That is massive success, and it's going to take the time that it takes, right? And it's most important that you do it right, that you do it at your pace and what you're ready for, and you do it sort of once and be done with it. Because to force yourself to take steps you're not ready for because of like societal pressure sort of shows how that narc still has power over you, right? Because you're abandoning yourself, you're betraying yourself, which are things that we do when we are experiencing narcissistic abuse. So it is okay to be vehemently protective of yourself and to advocate for what you're ready for and what you're not, right? And taking your time to work through these steps, because these steps are going to be vital in making sure that you are not a future host, right? But with that, we do see some people who heal from their past, but then they don't equip themselves for the future. They just sort of cross their fingers and knock on wood that they're never going to bump into a narcissistic person again, and hope that if they do, they know how to handle it. I have a lot of clients who say things like, okay, I'm free from that person. I'm no longer scared of them. I've healed from them. But if I bumped into a male authority figure in a position of power who started criticizing me and creating conflict, I feel like I'd buckle, right? I feel like I couldn't stand on my own. We want to focus on those things and focus forward once we've done the healing, so that we have a shield around us, these protective factors, to make sure that we don't have that sign on our forehead that tends to light up for narcissists only, right? So this is a weird example that's sort of backwards, but if you've ever saw the movie World War Z, and I'm giving a spoiler alert here, so if you haven't seen it, I don't know, mute me. In that movie, World War Z, there is like a zombie apocalypse, right? And it's like a virus that spreads, but that virus can only spread to healthy hosts, right? They discover that the way to beat this horrific virus is to actually like be sick, right? Because then that zombie virus won't even want them. They just bypass them, right? We see that in the movie. They just bypass these sick people. They won't even touch them. And that is the image that came to mind for me when thinking about this, because that's what we want. We want we don't want to know how to stand up to a narcissist only. We want them to avoid us like the plague. We want to infect ourselves with what they consider to be something completely undesirable, right? So that they won't even come near us. Now, the ingredients for that is not like in the movie where it's an actual sickness. The ingredients to make yourself an unviable host for a narcissist are several things. And I'm gonna list them out to you, but I'm gonna first do them in reverse. So what a narcissist looks for a viable host, somebody that they want to infect, we'll say, is somebody who is easily manipulated, who people pleases or fawns, has low self-esteem and low self-confidence. If we're talking narcissistic males, they're going to look for either males or females that have a lot of internalized misogyny because of those power dynamics and the control dynamics that play a role with misogyny. They're going to look for somebody who has codependency issues, primarily people that maybe have like an insecure or anxious attachment style, who have childhood trauma or who had issues with their own parents. We often see children of narcissistic parents get into relationships with narcissistic people in adulthood for this reason. But they look for codependency particularly because they need that. They look for people that are vulnerable socially. So maybe they don't have a lot of support, or maybe they're vulnerable economically or financially. Sometimes we see narcissistic people who are extremely wealthy, and so they will use their money they'll find somebody who's struggling and they will buy them, and then they own them in that way. So they'll use their money to try to entrap them. Or we can see it in reverse. We can see a narcissist who struggles financially and is looking for somebody who's stable, but they often will create a dynamic where you are owed to them in some way, and finances play a role in that. So they look for those things, right? They look for people that have a lack of support and a lack of accountability or loved ones. So people that have estranged relationships or sort of alone. If you're somebody who's got a ton of support, you've got real ones for friends, you've got loved ones who have your back, it's going to be really difficult for a narcissist to isolate you or destroy those relationships. Now, of course, we can't always control things like the environments we were born into and the people that we have in our life, but prioritizing learning how to have healthy, normal relationships is going to play a really big role in that, right? So these are the things that a narcissist looks for in a viable host. We want to become an unviable host, right? We want to be somebody that they don't even want to touch. Now, typically what that looks like is narcissists will not typically come near or even want to interact with somebody who is confident, strong, self-aware, a very self-assured person, who can self-advocate, who can speak up. I say the term loud, but I don't mean loud in terms of volume. Someone who's not conflict resistant, someone who's not confrontation afraid. That is all just completely unattractive to the narcissist, right? I think of things like bullies, right? If you think of sort of some stereotypical bully scenarios, maybe in elementary or high school, right? Bullies tend to seek out social outcasts without a lot of support, who are really insecure, who are not going to fight back. They often are not going to go near the super popular, self-assured, outspoken, person that has support. Or I think of, like, looking at the animal kingdom, I think of like hyenas and lions, right? Like 10 hyenas will detour their path to leave one lion alone because they don't want to mess with that energy, right? This is the mindset we want to get ourselves into. We want to become a lion, become somebody that the narcissist not only has no use for, but is too scared to come near because they are at a disadvantage, right? So there is a whole other step. This is part of kind of step 7, but this is like residual, or it's like a bonus step 8 that we see, that when you get to the place where you're like, okay, I want to make myself narc proof, right? We're going to work on things like knowing who you are and trusting yourself. And as I go through these, you guys are going to hear those 6 factors of sense of self, right? We're rebuilding who we are. We're going to know who we are and we're going to trust ourselves. Narcissists have to be able to make you deny reality or doubt yourself, and becoming somebody who's like, no, I know what I saw. No, I know what I believe. No, I know what I heard. They've got no use for that, right? They don't want to come near that. We're going to become somebody who's confident and bold and self-assured and even outspoken. Because so much narcissistic abuse tends to be covert, they don't like a spotlight on anything that they're doing. And a person who will speak up and speak out is sort of like a giant spotlight on them, right? I'm not encouraging that we put everybody on blast. I'm not saying that you have to be super confrontational or loud in that way. But if you are coming from a place where you were very much fawning, people pleasing, very meek, very codependent, very quiet about what you went through, it can feel like this huge pendulum swing, and it can feel like a huge overreaction to just be a self-assured, ready and able to speak up person. An example here that I see on this is a lot of people with narcissistic abuse have trouble advocating for themselves with something like their medical or mental health. I'll have clients who want to ask for an extra session and they feel like a burden, and they feel like that they're being mean, and they feel like that they're taxing me, and they're scared I'm going to be mad at them, right? But in the land of normal, a self-assured, confident person who can self-advocate for themselves has no problem saying, hey, I'm really in need of an extra session, or no, I'd really like to have that test done, or I'd like to get a second opinion. So we have to work through a lot of those mindsets and get to that place. We're really going to work on our strong connections to healthy relationships and loved ones. If you are a victim of narcissistic abuse within your family, particularly from a parent, we often have to go through the process of finding our tribe, and our tribe is not often our family. This lends itself to a whole other level of healing, and when you discover who you are, who your people are, we often have to heal from that relationship trauma so that we can make those secure connections again. Friendships are the best place to start with that, especially if your narcissistic abuse came from romantic relationships. But we do need people. We need community. We need people that have our backs, that will support us, that are sounding boards. And it's sort of like protecting ourselves with extra people, right? We're not going to be that lone wounded deer. We're going to find our herd. We're going to practice and learn how to become open and transparent. A lot of people with narcissistic abuse hid the abuse. So they might post on social media about how amazing their husband is, or how perfect their family is, or how great their life is. And behind closed doors, it's a different story. And many people suffer from people doubting them or victim blaming them when they come out and say, hey, this has been happening the whole time. So we learn to live a more authentic, open, transparent life so that that's not possible anymore. So that any narcissist that would come into your life that would try to treat you a certain way knows that what happens here is going to be talked about here. That's why a lot of narcissistic people don't like their partners or loved ones being in therapy, because they know it's going to be talked about. Right? I mentioned boundaries earlier, but this is so incredibly vital, right? Having boundaries, which, remember, is not telling other people what to do, it's telling other people what you will do, which comes from a place of self-love that holds people accountable, is probably the best protective factor we have against future narcissistic abuse. When working with people with romantic narcissistic abuse, one of the things we practice when they begin dating again is learning how to say no to something on the very first date, even if it's like a refill for a drink or a second order of fries, because no is a boundary. And you're going to learn a lot about a person by setting a boundary. Narcs tend to out themselves when they bump into a boundary. So boundary work is so, so important, and something that can take time, and we have to have in every area of our life. But it is your shield that will protect you from future abuse. And then the last couple of things, of course, are things like knowing your worth. Narcissistic abuse destroys our sense of worth, and we do have to build that back up to a place to where we know what we're worthy of, and we are unwilling to settle for less, however that may look, whether that's in the workplace or romantic life or just your interpersonal relationships. We also have to know what the norm is. And I use the word norm here very loosely, not as sort of this value judgment of like normal, but in reality, narcissistic abuse and the world that we live in when we are being abused by a narcissist is a totally different world than what's going on over here. There's a quote that I love that says, it's something very simple, but it says something along the lines of, normal people don't go around trying to destroy other people. There are millions and millions, if not billions, of people out there who are not looking to take advantage of, not looking to tear down, not looking to feed off of the pain and hurt of another person. There are people out there that understand what boundaries are and appreciate them and respect other people and know how to honor them and understand that no is a complete sentence and that people have a right to autonomy in whatever way that may look. We have to relearn what normal is, and with that, raise the bar. Narcissistic abuse tends to put our bar on the ground, and we've got to get that bar high, much higher than you even think it should be. I tell my clients to double whatever they think that bar is, and it can feel very, very uncomfortable, but it's one of the best ways to protect yourself from future narcissistic abuse because you're too much work. They're looking for easy, right? And so you want to make it work, right? And all these things end up being these protective barriers so that even in a crowd where we are reading people's energies and nervous systems are communicating, a narcissist will look right over you like the zombies did in World War Z. They'll see the confidence. They'll see the self-assuredness. They'll hear you speaking. They'll see you around people. They'll catch that vibe that you're not somebody that's a wounded deer that they can pull away from the herd. And you won't even have to try to get away from them or not deal with them because they'll want nothing to do with you, right? That's the goal. All right, so lots of information, but I have questions for you to consider on this. And then if you guys decide that you want to talk more on this or want a follow-up session, just let me know. So questions to consider. Number 1, what steps of healing do I need to take? Where are you? Did you jump to 7 and you need to go back to 1? Do you need to work on safety? Do you need to learn more about the nervous system? Have you been avoiding dealing with the past trauma? Like, what's the step you need to take? Number 2, what areas within yourself make you vulnerable to narcissistic abuse? Do we have codependency issues? Are we insecure? Do we have low self-confidence? Are we conflict avoidant? Do we still doubt ourselves? Where are the kinks in our armor? Where's our shield weak that could make us susceptible to narcissistic abuse? And the last question is, what does a narc immune version of you look like? I want you to take time and picture yourself as a narc immune person, right? That embodies all of those traits that we just discussed. Watch it like a movie. Watch yourself going to the grocery store or going to work and coming home or interacting in your relationships. What do you look like, sound like? How do you carry yourself? What do you say? What do your relationships look like? What do you do? It can be really powerful to envision those things and to practice visualizing those things because our mind has a way of sort of having us gravitate toward them. But we also want to get an idea of who it is we're working to become, right? Because we're intentionally creating this version of ourselves. So those are the questions to consider. All right, if you guys have any questions on this, of course, feel free to reach out to me. You can message me or put it in the general chat. And if you want to hear more on it, let me know. I know I kept you a little bit of time, but I'm going to wrap the recording and I'll be able to hang for a couple minutes for any questions you guys have.